Hey, welcome in. Well, we have the headline here. Head of BC Civil Liberties Group under fire over burn it all down tweet. Burn it all down. Now, the backdrop to this is that there have been a number of churches burnt down in the wake of the national scandal where there's been a number of unmarked graves found at residential schools. And as I say, it's a national scandal. It needs to be investigated thoroughly and every effort made to determine what exactly happened. And that's going to take a while. But in the meantime, because we have social media, people are saying things, including the head of the BC Civil Liberties Group, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association. And what did she say? In response to a tweet from Vice World News about 2 more Catholic churches being burnt down, she tweeted, "Burn it all down." Now, what does she mean by that exactly? Does she mean burn down all the churches? Does she mean burn down society? Burn down all of society? Does she mean burn down the world? I don't know. Does that violate Twitter's terms of service? Doesn't really matter, does it? But in any case, it seems like an odd thing for the head of a civil liberties association to tweet. It makes me wonder if she's concerned with civil liberties or maybe something else. Anyway, an executive director of the BC Civil Liberties Association is facing criticism over comments she made on social media in response to the burning of multiple churches in the wake of the discovery of human remains in unmarked graves at former residential schools. Harsha Walia leads the organization, and I just want to say, do not contact anybody ever that I mention in these videos. It is totally counterproductive, and just don't do it. But in any case, this organization, which according to this article fights for civil liberties and human rights. She is also a longtime advocate for migrant justice, Indigenous rights, equality, and economic justice. Anyway, there were some responses to that tweet of burn it all down, whatever she means by all. Somebody, Nico Slabinski, I don't understand why the executive director of the BC Civil Liberties Association is calling for violence. Violence and hate don't appear to be solutions being proposed by Indigenous communities. And it is their voices we should be listening to and respecting on this matter. Also, there's another one. Thank you for calling out Harsha Walia. Incredible lack of judgment. So calling to burn it all down is a lack of judgment. Well, I will agree. It is a lack of judgment. Being a leader is not about burning things down, but working towards building things up. I am here to work with our First Nations in a constructive, non-violent way. That is reconciliation. Sounds reasonable to me. Not everybody was against it, though. Here's somebody, Erica Eiffel. This seems appropriate, but as usual, Canadian whiteness is gleefully tone policing and harassing a powerful, racialized woman from telling the truth. Sending solidarity to Harsha Walia. So the person who talks about Canadian whiteness is very supportive of the person who wants to burn everything down and who just happens to be the head of the BC Civil Liberties Association. This is starting to not look so good for the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, isn't it? Let's see, here's somebody else. It's sad what's happening to Harsha Walia, but let me be clear, I would help her burn it all down. I would help her burn it all down. Okay, Twitter censors, are you listening? And that would light our way forward. So the light of the fires of, I guess, civilization burning would light the way forward. Maybe hasn't thought this through all the way. And also, I would help defend anyone charged with arson if they actually did burn things. Again, Twitter. Twitter. Aren't you supposed to be against calls to violence, which this appears to be? And by the way, this is a Twitter blue check mark, right? So Twitter apparently thinks this person is fairly important. Aside from the point that, a modern technological society, which we all benefit from today, is really hard to build. And you might find out that it's not so easy to rebuild some utopian society in its ashes. It might be that all you've got is ashes. I mean, I know you love your iPhone. You wouldn't want anything to happen to it, would you? You'd want to be able to keep getting iPhones, right? Anyway, Walia has since locked her Twitter account, but let's take a peek. Let's see. Author of Border and Rule plus Undoing Border Imperialism. So this is a open borders person. What is she interested in? Race, feminism, empire, capitalism. But anyway, let's take a look at this Undoing Border Imperialism. What is border imperialism? The idea of border imperialism was put forward by South Asian organizer, activist, and author Harsha Walia. So I guess the leader of the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association is not Canadian. Okay? It's just interesting that that's left out, right? Anyway, the term urges us to think beyond national boundaries as mere static delineations of territories and to make the necessary connections between borders and colonialism, dispossession, displacement, and racism, all of which interlock and continue today. So she is a far leftist. I mean, it doesn't say capitalism in that, but you know she's against it. That literally is inseparable from this. Marxism is inseparable from these ideas. Let's see. Border imperialism as a concept thus enables us to understand how borders function as instruments of segregation and ultimately as weapons of empire. In this way, Walia demonstrates that borders are apparatuses of state violence and that borders kill. So, open borders. I guess world government. So this is somebody who doesn't think that Canada should exist as a country, apparently. Because without borders, you don't have countries. And here we have the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association website. And this shows something interesting about the organization. Should white supremacist organizations be designated as terrorist organizations? So just so you know, anybody they don't like is a white supremacist organization, okay? But this is interesting. Let's see. So they start out with an assumption. The white nationalist insurrection at the Capitol in the U.S. on January 6, 2021, prompted the Canadian government to first unanimously pass an unofficial motion at the House of Commons and subsequently officially designate the Proud Boys as a terrorist entity. 12 organizations were also added at the same time. So this is just full of bullshit. White nationalist insurrection at the Capitol. There is no evidence that this had anything to do with white supremacy. And there's no evidence that this was an insurrection. For one thing, none of them were armed, which would seem odd for an insurrection. It was quite clearly a riot. Half the people that went into the building were let in by the police. And it's quite obvious that their reason for being there was to protest what they thought was an insecure, illegitimate election. Okay? There is no evidence whatsoever of any white supremacy, that this was a white supremacy, white nationalist insurrection. That is just an unfounded, unbased assertion. I know it feels good for people on the left to say that, because they assume that everything is white nationalist or white supremacy or whatnot. There just isn't any evidence of that. And that's the problem, isn't it? Also, the Proud Boys, I don't know if they're still led by, they were led for a long time by Enrique Tarrio, who is not white. It would seem very peculiar for a white nationalist organization or a white supremacist organization to have a non-white person as their leader. I mean, that should be obvious to people. That should be obvious. Just as the reason for the riot at the Capitol. It should be obvious to people. And as for Canada designating the Proud Boys as terrorists, what did they do exactly? What did they do in Canada? Anyway, they are actually against listing the Proud Boys, who they mischaracterize, as a terrorist group for their own reasons. I think for reasons that actually do make sense. Listing white supremacist groups, and this is a tweet from the BC Civil Liberties Association, listing white supremacist groups as terrorist entities in Canada is not going to end white supremacy. And you have to keep in mind, because they're leftists, they just assume that Canada is a white supremacist country, okay? But anyway, it will invoke national security and counter-terrorism systems that will end up harming the very communities that have been the target of groups like the Proud Boys. So in other words, anybody's going to be targeted. So that is sensible and at least in some way principled from them. The problem is with the BC Civil Liberties Association is that they're operating off a fantasy world, a dystopian fantasy world. If anybody thinks that Canada is a white supremacist country, just look at who's in Canada and ask yourself if a white supremacist culture would allow that to happen. Would it allow Harsha Walia to be in Canada, calling Canada a white supremacist country and saying to burn it all down? Obviously not. I mean, this is so stunningly obvious that it truly shocks me that anybody could believe this. It is absurd. You wouldn't have immigration. A white supremacist nation would not allow non-white people to move there, let alone harshly criticize it and call for it to be burned down. This should be stunningly obvious. Anyway, she's interviewing somebody from the Islamophobia Legal Assistance Hotline. And here's something that he says, which obviously there's no pushback against. If we want to dismantle white supremacist organizations at their core, we need to first dismantle the culture and system of white supremacy that exists within our communities and institutions. So burn it all down doesn't seem very far from that, does it? And I guess they don't seem to get the irony that a group called the Islamophobia Legal Assistance Hotline could exist in a, quote, culture and system of white supremacy. Even though, I mean, Islam is not a race in any case. It's an ideology, essentially. But you take my point. The idea that that organization could exist, if what he's saying is true, is obviously absurd. It would not be allowed to exist. So perhaps it's not a culture and system of white supremacy. I don't know. Just that would make sense, right? But maybe with sense, it's a bit too much to ask for. So, I mean, what we see here is just another institution that has been hijacked by dogmatic leftists who are operating in schizophrenic moral confusion. And I guess one thing I would say is certainly don't donate to this group because you simply can't trust them to make rational decisions. I'm sorry, when the executive director is saying burn it all down, you don't deserve anybody's trust or anybody's money. Anyway, that's all I got to say about that. Please subscribe, like, and share. That really helps me out. If you just like to listen, there's the podcast, Radio Baloney. It's on pretty much every platform. If you look for it, you will find it. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.